one of the points they make is that your customers will always lie to you all the time because they want to make you happy. And I think it's stuff like that where I've called people liars, where I'm like, okay, are you telling me what I want to hear? Right? Or are you telling me what I need to hear? And
now we are set.
You're good?
Yeah. Because I remember I did a podcast with my dad and the audio kept going out. So I was wondering what the issue was. But now I'm just turning on all this backup. Just
take 10 recordings and mix it.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So let's first, I think, start with who is Andrew for the audience listening and give them your elevator pitch.
Sure. So I've been one way or another building software since the late 90s. As a hobby as a kid, and then it became a vocation when I got a bit older. So I'm currently a product manager, but have spent most of my career in product design.
And how do we know each other?
That's a great question. So through a mutual correspondence, Preet Singh was the founder of DesignX. I met him initially, and then I believe it was at the very first DesignX event that you and I met. I don't remember the topic, but we were chatting after the event. I do remember that.
Yeah, we met at Miami Ad School on Queen Street at Preet's first DesignX event. And it's surprising that how many people I know through Preet.
Yeah. Mr. is very well connected, very friendly, very approachable guy, smart, obviously. So it's easy to draw people in, and then once you're in, can't let them go.
Actually, so before we actually get into your actual story, I would love to, and this is for people listening, that Preet actually now runs a very massive design community. He does conferences, events. There's an online version of design community, and of course, I'm just going to shamelessly plug DesignX into the conversation, even though I'm not in any way affiliated or make any money out of it. But it's a fantastic community that he's built, and of course, I also want to have him on the podcast. I've been after him and he's like, yeah, just let this thing happen. Okay, let the baby be born. Now let me just go to Europe, come back. And then so he's just been putting it off, but I get it. No worries. So where I was actually going with this was, what's that secret role that that part that you played in DesignX, which very few people know about?
I don't remember the exact date, but while I was working, a friend of mine, the CTO at our company, was part of a Slack community just for tech leadership, basically. And I wasn't aware of anything similar, at least in Toronto. So I spun up Design TO as a Slack community, and sort of promoted that for a couple of months. Early into that, I'd say a month or two in, Preet ended up joining, and we ended up chatting. That's how he and I first connected. And at the time, he asked me, he was really interested in starting a community, similar focus, really trying to initially bring the design community in Toronto together. And so we decided to kind of partner up on that. And as the community grew, a couple hundred people in that Slack channel, then Preet was asking, okay, I have this, I want to turn it into DesignX. He already had a branding, an idea of what he wanted it to be. And so we agreed to effectively merge the two together. So Design TO became DesignX as far as the Slack community. And then Preet and I worked together early in those days to moderate it and help it grow. And then as he really took the reins and ownership over the entire in-person aspect, so the events, that Miami School one being the first one he ran entirely without me. I showed up to support, but I since then have taken a significantly backseat role, support him if he needs help, but largely that is all him, and he deserves all the glory for what it has become.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what we were talking about at Miami Ad School at the first DesignX event. You were like, yeah, so we started this Slack thing, and here we are, which was really cool. I think that a lot of people, and in this situation, I felt that it told me a lot about who you are as a person, that you had like this abundant mindset, that you were like, hey, additive thinking of like, how do we grow this versus like, oh, this is my thing. Fuck off. Right. So
yeah, no, my historically throughout most of my life, my ambition is to build things, but to build people at the same time. Right. So be inclusive, bring people along, help others, overcome the challenges, right? Empower people to empower themselves. And so that challenge, that opportunity was really really interesting. And so when Preet came in and had this ambition for what he thought Design could be and where he'd like to take it, it was a natural fit. It was a no-brainer for me. And the idea that, Design TO would go away and was never a concern. I was just happy to have what at the time I thought of as a partner in Preet, and someone who kind of saw the world the same way I did.
It's rare to find that these days, that because a lot of people are like, me, my thing, I've built this, and it's also on the contrary, this is something that we can talk about a little bit into the weeds of the conversation, is about, how you lead a team, how you work. And we'll get into some of that stuff. I don't want to jump way past ahead, but why don't we start with the most basic question is, how did you actually get into design?
That's a great question. The short version is I didn't. When I was younger, say mid 90s, 95 or so, I would have been 13, a kid. My dad bought us a Commodore 64 computer. It came with a book. You had to program everything. There was nothing. So at the back of the book was how to build a Space Invaders game. And so I figured, well, I like games. So I followed the instructions, coded the game, started to play it. And that basically was the thing that got me hooked on the possibility of what a computer could be one day. And so my imagination took hold. It became a passion of mine. As computers developed and I got another one that was a bit more, capable, could run Windows and this kind of thing. And then at the same time, the internet was becoming more available, generally speaking. So I got on board to that early, started kicking around with early days, HTML websites. There wasn't very much as far as the CSS spec goes or anything like that, but just curious about it. What could I build? What is this new medium, basically? And eventually, but all this was all focused on building, not aesthetics, not design, no concept of how to build well or user experience, anything like that. It was really just the days of, eventually GeoCities and badly designed web pages, but it was just experimentation at that point.
How old were you, by the way, at that point when you were experimenting with all this stuff?
Maybe about 15.
Holy smokes.
15, 16, probably. I lived in the basement. I ended up not going to school much. Instead, I decided to stay on the computer. That ended up resulting in me being expelled from high school. My parents were not thrilled about that. But, I made a lot of choices that I didn't know I was making to lean into this medium, this new opportunity, this space that was really exciting and interesting to me. Not appreciating that it was early days for this type of space to work in. That software was a thing that I even knew of as a product, as even using Windows 95 and having Microsoft be around as an omnipresent company. It's like I didn't really put two and two together. I didn't know it was a software company that was even an option. Just interesting stuff.
From what I'm gathering is it's not, at that age, and I remember my days as well, that, you're not necessarily aware of the category or this thing. You're just like fascinated by this new piece of gear and technology. And so which part of Canada did you have that basement?
Still here in Mississauga. We lived with my mom. My parents were divorced at that time, so she'd go to work and I was supposed to go to school and I would just go downstairs. And then spend, 10 hours on the computer until I was told to get off of it, go eat. And then I go back downstairs and stay on it until 2 a.m. and just repeat basically for a couple of years. And then, what was interesting, the pivot for me was Macromedia came out with Flash and an ActionScript, which was a language that backed it. And so you could all of a sudden do really interesting things with physics, and you could control animations. And this is entirely now a sort of a level up on what you could do. And everyone now wanted a banner that was on their website, had motion involved. And so I leaned into that. And I think that was the first space where designing and worrying about how something moved across the screen or interact with other components began to seep in. And I started building them and selling them for, people who had the Random GeoCities website and wanted something interesting to on the top of it. And I would say that was the first point where I was like, oh, all of this, not only can I build a thing, but now I can impart some sort of personal style and aesthetic to it that started to lean into the design aspect.
In these early days, what kind of softwares and what kind of tools were you poking around and playing with?
Extremely limited, right? So at the time, just HTML, CSS was 90% of it. Started to dip my toes in Python at the time. Didn't go far, to be honest. It's not like I became a developer at any point, but enough that I could at least build a basic website. Didn't have to do much back then. They weren't used for much of anything, right? It's the internet was basically a bunch of static documents. That's really all it was. Certainly not what it is today.
Yeah. Do you remember what some of the earlier things that you were building and built?
Not really. It's funny. The things that stand out to me prior to Macromedia and ActionScript and that sort of thing really were just, the odd game, but again, just following an instruction booklet because it was fun and interesting. And then it really was when it was like, oh, I could build websites that I could put content into and would be some sort of representation of, either a story you wanted to write or a bunch of pictures you found and you wanted to sort of put them together. It was just almost scrapbooking, a digital kind of scrapbooking approach, which is funny to say now. But it wasn't until a bit later where, I think Macromedia sold to Adobe. I believe that's the move they made. And then Photoshop began to have much more of a presence in web design and that sort of thing, where then it was, my mindset changed to, well, this can be something I could do, like for real do. It could be a job. I could start designing these pages and these websites for businesses and friends of mine who were, maybe doing their own consulting businesses. I'd build websites for them. And that was kind of the beginning of turning it more into a job.
At that time, did you know that design is what you were doing, or was that something that you got exposed to later? And then
definitely later. I would say, I did that for fun. Again, I had no post-secondary, so I was just doing odd jobs, working in warehouses to make some amount of money to survive, and then doing this on the side for fun. Even if I made money at the time, that was mostly to survive. Be like, oh, I need to pay a bill, even though I lived in a basement, but I still had expenses and they had to be paid every month. And so at some point this was like, well, you need to find a way to make that money. What skills, what can you sell? What can you provide a value? And this was the thing that was uniquely me in a space where very few other people that I knew anyways could do this. And so I'd really just do it as a way to survive the next month or 2 months. And then eventually I stopped that. I went and did something entirely different for 5 or so years. And then I made the decision that maybe I should try going to school for graphic design or something in this space that would actually lean into the creative aspect of the process, which I had come to really appreciate.
Wait, so do you remember your first client, the first time you actually got paid for playing around with your computer?
Yeah. The first meaningful one was I met a friend through speed skating. It was a sport that I got into when I was really young as well. And he lived in Ottawa and was basically had been working for Nortel for many years as a developer. He was part of the implosion, was eventually let go. And so he decided to start his own independent development shop. So he would actually go out, be contracted to build products, websites, what have you. But he didn't have a designer. And so I did that. So he and I would partner on small jobs, particularly considering today, but I'd do $1,000 job here or $2,000 job there, but it'd be he and I who would be doing these sorts of things. And they would be for the clients that he would find for us. And so at that point, I was just kind of contracting my services out with him. And every now and then I would bring someone to the table, and that would be interesting in that I'd meet someone who needed that service, but I couldn't build it. And so I'd go back to him and the two of us would decide to partner on something. The difference there was that all of a sudden I was put in a position to control the economics of the relationship. Whereas before he'd say, well, here's the budget. Can you do it for this amount? Now I was the one saying, here's the budget. Can you do it for this amount? And I would, then I would keep 2/3 of the revenue, whereas he was doing that before. So it was fair, it was equitable in what we ended up doing, but it opened my eyes how I could control how much I was paid, whether I felt worth that or not worth that. It entirely changed my approach to valuing my contributions to a project and what I could bring to a client.
Damn. And by the way, how old were you when you were doing this?
I'm going to say probably between some of them happened in around 18 to 21. And then again, when a little bit later, I would have been 25, but started fairly early. Yeah.
So do you have like front end and back end?
No back end, and limited front end. I ended up playing with a lot of libraries more than fundamental languages. So I didn't go deep into JavaScript or Java or any front end languages. What I would do is things like jQuery, for example, was a packaged library. I could just find different ways to have the effect that I was looking for applied to the site that I was working on. And then I would break it and rebuild it until it did exactly what I wanted. And that was my sort of way of learning how things worked well enough to accomplish the task I was interested in. And then I'd abandon it entirely and move on to the next thing. So certainly not a developer, front or back end. I really learned enough, though, that today, if I needed to, I could stub in a full page, full product on the front end side, aesthetic and structure wise, but there'd be nothing behind that. I'd need someone to actually do the work of making it function.
Could you recall, or do you remember one or two or any number of skills or early ways of thinking and approaching problem solving that you developed on your own?
Yeah, I think this is something that I developed accidentally, but is something that I keep tight to the chest today. It's still equally important, which is in that environment, there was very little support, right? It's not like you had Wikipedia articles or YouTube to go learn things. So we had to find resources, which were usually difficult to find. And then they were incomplete at that, right? So, because everyone was in a similar spot. So really you had to learn how to learn, and you had to be resilient in doing that, proactive, and, having a vision of what you were trying to achieve, but without any clear path to get there. So you had to break things and try things and fail frequently until something clicked and something worked. And that was enough for you to take the next step and repeat the process of failing until the next piece worked. I was lucky at the time that there were some small communities that did exist, but they were difficult to find either on news groups or IRC or different chat environments where you could find like-minded people running through similar problems. That was very helpful, but challenging to find, and then you're waiting for a human being to be available to chat with you about a problem you were having. So I think those characteristics are equally, if not more important now in, being driven, being proactive in how you attack problems, not being afraid to ask for help, but also acknowledging that regardless of how someone helps you, it's still on you to do the work. You still have to put the effort in. So being also relentless in your pursuit of being able to achieve your vision.
So at what point did you, take all these different experiences and start thinking about it as a professional career, as design? Like,
that was very clear. I was in Europe at the time, living in Switzerland. I had been for a number of years. I decided to stop doing everything else in favor of trying to get good at speed skating. So I did that like single-mindedly for many years, but I happened to be in Europe at the end of a contract to race there with a team. And you don't make very much money in a niche sport like that. So I was thinking about what comes next. I had a choice to make, which was to come back again for another year or to try to enter the workforce, make a career of something that I had forgotten I enjoyed doing because it had been a few years. So I made the decision when I got back to apply to school, specifically looking for programs that could help me do more of that visual design, the building aspect. There weren't many. The closest that I found that seemed to align with what I liked was a graphic design program at Fanshawe College in London, Ontario. So I applied there and then spent the next 3.5, 4 years going to school focused almost entirely on graphic design, which I think was a very enjoyable experience.
It's almost like a hobby at that point where you're playing around with the computer, you're learning all these different tools. But then I think you're at that time, I'm making the assumption is, and you should let me know, is skating was your primary obsession and passion. Yep. And this computer thing was secondary.
Yeah, I'd started doing both at about the same age, as it turned out. And skating was something that I did for fun. It was just like any sport you do as a kid. But then I got a little bit better at it and a little bit better at it. And then I wasn't going to school anymore. And, I was filling my time with part-time jobs and this hobby on the computer. But I was being pushed by the people around me to spend more and more time on the speed skating piece. Eventually in 2004, I had very close friends of mine who ended up qualifying to go to the World Championships. They did that. They all came back, and now they had these really inspirational stories of what that was like. And then that got me hooked. For the next few years, 3 or 4 years, I basically did nothing other than single-mindedly try to achieve the same things they had, just for the experience, not worried about winning per se, but it seemed to be this life experience that I had desperately not had that was very alluring.
The part that's actually more interesting is that they're all sort of disjointed from each other. It's like ice skating, and then here you're obsessed with computers. It's like they're so different. It's not even ancillary.
No, they're completely unrelated. I think the thread that is similar in retrospect is I don't like, in fact, I reject boundaries and being put in boxes and being labeled as good or bad at one thing or another. And so all of these things were sort of at some point became part of my identity, but not wholly my identity, right? It was okay for me to rationalize that I could be very good at any number of things, and hubris being what it is, you have a little bit of success in a couple of things, and then suddenly you believe you can be amazing at everything. And taken too far, that causes problems. But I think as far as ambition goes and the willingness to try things without worrying about failure, that was the part that I built into my identity that allowed me to tackle these very disparate things, these disconnected things, but I enjoyed the challenge of them. And that ended up being quite a lot of the motivation was achieving something through the effort, rather than maybe saying like, I enjoy playing a sport because it's fun. It's like, I enjoy winning at the sport. It's a very different approach. And that ended up being the driver for me.
One aspect is that, you're sort of interested in skating, and for that you even traveled outside of the country, which, a lot of people would, for a skill or a hobby or for a trade, that seldom does happen. So, but you did that. And that actually got you out of the basement. Right? Metaphorically speaking.
Oh, literally. It's one of the downsides of what I was doing in being so obsessed with the computer and working on it because I loved every aspect of it. It wasn't necessarily about designing anything, like just everything related to tech I was deeply interested in. But it started to negatively affect other aspects of my life, right? So I became very insular. I mean, leaving school is not good in the first place. But what it ended up doing is I built up this odd anxiety of things outside of that universe. So I would stay in the basement, stay on the computer, be in my sort of walled garden and live a very insular, a life that was very disconnected from my family, my friends, the rest of the world. I didn't notice that was happening. My friends did, particularly the people that I'd been skating with. And a few of them are responsible for pulling me out of that and putting me in a much healthier place. So they would physically come to my house and drag me out of the house to go to practice because they saw what was happening. And I think community is such an important part in hindsight. Recognizing the community is such an important part of who you are and how you grow. And I had been unintentionally removing myself from that community, and they leaned in to bring me back. And in doing so, they put me on a path where that became less important. The computers and design became less important, and the athletics became more important. But the major benefit of that was that I was now surrounded by hundreds of people, and I met tons of. I just had this entire series of experiences that I never would have had if I had stayed in the basement. I would argue none of the positive things that likely came after that would have been possible had I stayed, because I would have, perhaps in a self-destructive way, continued to look inwards on myself and push the world away. So the timing of that was incredibly important. And I don't think at the time they knew what they were doing, other than I wasn't where I was supposed to be from their perspective. And my mom couldn't do anything about it. So they forced the issue.
Yeah. Something about, as a kid, you just want to rebel against anything the parents are saying. But if that same thing comes from a friend, you're like, yeah, totally.
Yeah. And it was really hard for me. I ended up having a lot of social anxiety. Still have it to this day, but it was crippling then, to the point where I wouldn't leave the house. And so they physically would drag me out, bring me to this environment where I'd been there for years. It felt comfortable as soon as I got there, and I could then excel in that environment and feel supported and quite happy. But it's the in between, right? So going from comfortable spot to comfortable spot meant traveling in a very uncomfortable area. And I had a lot of difficulty doing that by myself early in my teenage years. Again, community of bringing me back and forth between that and allowing me to be comfortable in those environments, but also move between them. I never appreciated it as a kid, but now looking back, it was incredibly important. I can't imagine if I hadn't done that, what would have happened. I don't suspect it would have been good.
I mean, we could go off on a quick tangent here, is that there's so many parallels to what you're saying with remote work. And what I mean by that is, let me set some context here. First is that for the new generation that's coming in, that's never worked in an office environment, AKA they're metaphorically in that basement, right, in their brain. And so they've not, for example, interacted with somebody face to face, looked in their eyes as they're talking to them. You can't replicate that on Zoom, no matter how HD it gets. And versus, somebody like you and I now today who've worked in an office environment, and then we have now we're in a situation where we've hybrid, we're partly remote and partly when we go into the office, because there's just something about sitting across with somebody, looking at facial expressions, body language, inflections in their voice, that tells you so much more than a text message or some dry email. So that's sort of the context of the parallel that I'm seeing of what was you were experiencing at that time with the world that we are in today.
I think that they can all work, fully on site, hybrid, fully remote. I do think that I agree with you in that your access to other people is really important. And if your primary way to interact with other people, to build a community, is by going to work, then being on site is incredibly important for your mental health. If you have other vocations, other avenues outside of that, whether it's playing sports or being involved in other communities or having a friend group from high school or college that you see, then you have outlets outside of work that allow for you to still be connected with people, that still allows for that healthy interplay between people. I think the big risk with fully remote is if you don't have that. If your community, the people you interact with, happen to be your work environment, but you never see them in person, then it is now challenging to build bonds, to, like you mentioned, to work off of each other's physical cues. So you really have to put in the effort in that case to do more, more rituals that will feel maybe at the beginning forced, but then you rely on them. That standing meeting every Friday where we're all going to jump on a call and just kind of shoot the shit about how the week went and what we're doing on the weekend. That needs to become a regular routine that you adopt. I think if you're hybrid or fully remote, it's really healthy. Without those things, though, I think it's easy to feel like you're being lost a bit, or you're not grounded with other people. So it becomes much more important in that scenario to build friendships outside of work and have hobbies and things that you enjoy doing, so that you aren't sort of living inside your house, working inside your house, and the only time you ever leave is to, if at all, is to go buy groceries maybe, but you can order those too, right? For me, it's a risk in that it's really easy. And I find myself doing this now. It is easy for me to go a day or two without ever going outside. It's not good. That's not healthy. But that's where I think you have to find a way to build those routines in.
So as a leader and as somebody who's been in the trenches at the early stage, what kind of takeaways or lessons would you want to give to people who are, let's say, starting a company? Actually, hold on. Let's set a little bit of a context. So let's say, with all your experiences, you're moving into, let's say, a new role. You have to set up a team, and there's the composition of that team is going to be some people who are going to be completely remote. Some people are going to be hybrid, and some people are going to be, I don't even think there's a thing called now full-time in-person IRL. So it's so much easier to build culture and set the tone of what it's like to work in that company and the environment, the atmosphere when you're in person. But as a leader now, what are the challenges and how do you sort of overcome those when building a team?
Well, I think culture is defined and reinforced by your actions more than words, more than, declarations of what you want to be. So it becomes incumbent upon the leaders and the senior members of your team to reinforce what you value, how you want to operate, how you want to build, how you want to treat each other through action. Especially for someone new coming into the organization, in particular, if they happen to be younger, where they maybe don't have the experience themselves to have a strong opinion on what is good, what's an optimal way of behaving and working. So my approach generally is to be very explicit, to create a shared understanding with the team. So, it's a classic idea of let's all stand by a whiteboard and, let's all try to envision what this solution or idea is. It's like, well, everyone in their head has a different view of what that solution may be, right? And it's only in writing something down or drawing that this square is a square and we all agree it has four sides because we can see it. I think culture and the way that you operate is similar. So you can try to mimic what other companies do, right? That has its problems and that each company is a bit unique, particularly depending on stages, but how do we value operating together? So if you and I were to see each other every single day, work together, where are the places where we're going to naturally align on how we want to talk to each other, how we want to distribute work, how we want to hold each other accountable, and where are the places we have friction? Friction usually being either a philosophical perspective that is different or assumptions that have not been clarified. Right? You assume I meant one thing, I assume you meant another. and getting those really, really clear and then acting on them. So you can build routine to help reinforce those things. So we have a one-on-one doc, say with even with a senior individual and the team lead, to say, well, what do we value? Well, whatever's in the agenda of that document is likely an implicit order of value. So do I value status updates? Do I value how quickly we work? Do I value what we're focused on, how you're developing as an individual, how you're contributing to the outcome of the department or company's objectives? What are we talking about in that one-on-one meeting is going to heavily influence how you interpret what I value. And that then, if you're senior and you yourself have a junior report going on, you are going to likely mimic what I value down the chain, right? Everyone has their own flavor on that, but particularly in a newer company where you're trying to define culture, that culture initially comes from your leadership. Again, what do they talk about? How do they behave? It is then adopted by the people below them and adopted by the next set of people. So I think a really interesting approach is start with how you have these one-on-one conversations. What are you focused on? Is that meeting for you or is it for them? Is it to help them unblock things? Is it for them to stay focused on what matters? Are you helping them stay focused on what matters? Or are you going to reprimand them in 3 months' time in a performance review that, hey, you didn't do that thing that we talked about once? Well, there's a shared responsibility there, right? And I think that piece of how do you help other people be successful, it's part of one of those things that I value, is I would be successful if my team is successful. And for that to be true, we need to make sure we stay aligned on what the business needs of us, what our department needs of us. And it's not, I can't help them be successful if this is a one-time thing we talk about and then never again. And I just hope that they're going to get it. So we can have that one-on-one structure that helps to reinforce that. But we also have team rituals that we build that say, again, that every Friday is just a casual conversation. Well, if we start skipping those meetings, I'm going to push them out this week because one of the team members, worst of all, the leader of that team, maybe isn't there. What does that say through your actions? It really says that this meeting is not important to the team. Same thing with if you have to push one-on-ones frequently, then you're telling me, the individual, that you don't value this relationship enough to move the rest of your schedule around. Totally appreciating that things happen. But if this is a habit, then what you're signaling is our culture is a lack of caring, a lack of trust, a lack of consistency and safety. People do well in routines and with clear guidance and honest conversations. I have personally found it's a long way to sort of answer your question, I think, but it's in creating those routines and in ensuring that the team feels supported, because they are supported. We're trying to work together to ensure that we're achieving that outcome. Particularly important the smaller the company is and the closer to product market fit and trying to generate the first amount of revenue. These things become really, really important, where very off the rails very quickly.
That actually makes a lot of sense. And even that part that you were talking about where, just like a subtle sign that if people are not coming to the meeting or if they're pushing the one-on-ones, then what does that tell you about that event?
Yeah, a lot of companies will have values that they talk about, which is important to do. They've defined, the way that they want to work, the way that they treat people. All of this is great. And it may even be something that draws me as an employee to your company. When I start interviewing at your company and I start asking the people that I'm speaking to talk to me about values, to talk to me about what the culture is like, if I'm not seeing their answers reflect what you've publicly said, or maybe I decide to join anyways, and particularly because I'm hybrid or fully remote, I don't have an opportunity to just see you down the hall and we can connect on a personal level, on a quick 5-minute coffee chat. These are now rituals that I rely upon to feel connected to the business and you as an individual. So I think it's really important, even if your cadence is less frequent, it's important that you maintain that. It's a certain amount of trust and again, being anchored in that relationship that's incredibly important.
So coming back to your days where you're now, so we've come back out of the double clicks and we've come back from that tangent, and we're going to revisit it in a little bit later in the conversation. Is, by the way, I love going on tangents, and I'll go off on like a completely different path. And it's like,
I remember.
where were we? How did we even start talking about this? So you're working with this guy who's got a development agency business, and you're building websites. So at that time, I think you mentioned this was between 18 and 25 years old. So at that time, when you were, doing freelance and kind of running your own shop as an entrepreneur, what was happening in terms of education, and were you even thinking about getting your first job, and when did you get your first job? So let's go back into that era.
Yeah. Okay. Thing formal. What I was gravitating towards were some of the publicly available websites that had now started talking a lot more about design, product design, and I think that marriage of classical graphic design with digital medium and how that would change. So I remember when I went to school was when I started worrying a lot more about this sort of stuff instead of just running off of instinct. And the one that stands out to me that I still remember today is Smashing Magazine was a big influence early on. There's another publication called Eight Faces that I really liked for a while too. But I was just looking for people who were in the space, had some practical experience, real experience. It wasn't just theoretical, and then could guide me a little bit better job on whatever that project was that I was currently tackling. Another big influence for me was Mike Monteiro and Mule Design. I like many people gravitated towards and discovered him through "Fuck You, Pay Me" as his his very infamous talk. Which, again, coming from what I think is really interesting about that is I latched onto that, and I think many people did. The question was why, right? Because in the industry, for whatever reason, most people didn't look at design as a function, as something that was very valuable, particularly in the digital space. And so this idea that I would be asked to do work for free or for not very much money, or I shouldn't also be paid, was really at odds with that internal motivation and sense of value I had built by freelancing. I was like, well, no, I can charge for this. And so when those two things came together, it happened to be about the same time I was going to school. And this sort of really influenced the way that I started to tackle learning and connecting those dots.
Okay, there's a whole set of notions and ideas around, you got to defend the work, you got to fucking fuck you, pay me, like that kind of sentiment amongst creative people. And at the time, it resonated with me as well.
Yeah.
But as I mature as a professional, as a designer, and I recognize that whole sentiment is like putting the client as painting them as an enemy.
Yep.
And it's like you're doing it to them, versus kind of, as a more mature, in our careers and, as professionals, we're like, they're not the enemy. There's no fuck you, pay me. It's actually, you're working side by side.
That's true.
And if you have a great discovery and qualifying process, let's say, you can weed out the people you don't want to work with because it's just not a good fit. And the people you do end up working with, you actually work side by side as partners in the true sense.
Yeah.
And you don't have to get into the defensive because you're kind of like sharing stuff. And of course, this whole thing opens up a whole can of worms. But I know that you mentioned just for a hot second that what was the psychology that drew us to that video at that time versus how would you think about it now today looking back?
Loaded conversation.
I know. That's why I was like, that was because I didn't even think about it for a second, but now that you brought it, I was like, holy shit. Right.
Yeah. I have a few opinions on things that rub feathers the wrong way a few times, but Well, here goes. I think that the thing that happened is we went from having design agencies, advertising, and creative, what people thought of as creative in that lens. And then you had true artists, painters, sculptors, etc. Right? This is a very, like, if I think about the history of this coming out of being something that is not a real job, but is just something you do for fun that never makes a living, to then coming into advertising being a major push in the mid-century, then into the digital medium now with website design and then product design. One thing that happened was much of that technological shift, rightly so, is driven by technologically oriented folks. So developers first, right? And non-core technical folks who came afterwards had to fight to show how they could contribute. There are many companies that were built on the back of developers only. Engineers first, because they needed to be.
Salesforce, by the way, hideous design.
In that space, you now say, okay, well, why would I put yourself in their shoes? Why would I need to make space for this person who's just going to make it look better? I could do that. That's not that hard. You have all these other things, where you get into eventually into user research, you get into product management, project management. These are all things that if you're a really smart person, technically oriented, you understand how to build things. And in fact, you are lauded at that time. I'm thinking late 80s, early 90s, early aughts. You began to see this distribution of contributions. Right. So instead of just a one person who can do it all, well, if we actually allow a few people to specialize in certain areas, that we can get more out of the team as a whole. We build a better product that makes us financially more viable and successful. All great. Problem is, we're going to pay and how much. And I do think for a while there, this was this feeling, it was real, that it wasn't worth paying a lot of money for someone who was only going to make something look better, but functionally worked. And it took a long time, relatively speaking, for that to shift. It is still shifting. But now you have very mature businesses who understand the need to have a team that is comprised of different skill sets and people working together to build something, and that there is a financial reward in doing that well for the business. One of the problems I have is I really, that fuck you pay me piece really resonated me at the time, because we were very much in that shift of, well, I can't get a job that pays more than 50K, 40K as a designer. I think my first startup job, I was paid for $35,000 or $40,000. And this was the first startup I joined. And I was like, okay, I guess that's all right. And it's again around that time where you're having all this happen. Now it's very different. But what I observe now is there are still many people who have dragged this victim mentality of that time forward. And it's a massive problem. The design community as a whole, it is getting better, but as a community still seems to project a lack of agency, a lack of ownership over their own paths forward, whether that's career and skill set or earning potential. And because of that, I still hear a lot of, designers aren't valued in such and such a way, or aren't paid in such and such a way. And I'm not saying that this is over and they should just get over it, but I do think that this isn't 10 or 15 years ago. There's a lot more opportunity available to you to not look outside and blame others for why you're not seeing what you're seeing, but to look internally and find a path forward to improve yourself, to achieve, or to develop yourself, I should say, to meet what's available in the market. While I appreciated the fuck you pay me, now I don't think that same message is appropriate.
That is such a wholesome answer and spontaneous and impromptu, by the way. Nothing is prepared here. You have no idea.
Oh, and I'm sure there'll be a whole bunch of people who totally disagree with me, and that's great. That's totally fine. I have no problem having a conversation about it. I think it is, for what it's worth, I do think it is a bigger challenge in some industries than others. I think that there are certainly places where you can look at job postings today that where they do disclose salary, and it is quite low in certain industries relative to others. Tech obviously leading the way in comp and that sort of thing and impact. But, if that's true, then the idea that you vote for policy with your time and attention and money and these sorts of things, it's like, well, don't want jobs that are paying designers and product designers, these sorts of things. But it's like you can't reward the business for charging or for paying so little by accepting a job. Easy to say, really hard to do when you need a job, you need to make money and you have a family to support, or you're even just yourself. But there is that element of kind of go where the money is, go where the opportunities are. And if you don't yet have the skill set to meet those, how do you get there? How do you ask yourself, how do you build what's missing? And there's a lot of resources there to worry about, what do you need to be successful in a product company, particularly in the tech space, and try to better yourself to be able to meet that. It's hard. Like as a hiring manager in that role, I will tell you that it is really hard sometimes to, we had a job posting for product designer that I spent 3 months trying to fill, and I did eventually fill it. But every time I would have an interview with someone and review it, I really wanted to be able to help. When I said, no, it's not a good fit for one reason or another, it's like, how can I provide guidance in the conversations we've had in that follow-up to say, here's how I would suggest, not here's how you screwed up in our interview or why I didn't choose you, but here's the gap for us. Sometimes it's just, sometimes it's skill set, sometimes like hard or soft skills, one of the two of those. Sometimes it's things you really can't control, which is that the business needs you to do for example, be on site, and you can't. You have to be fully remote. And maybe we didn't know that before we had this conversation, but now we do. But if it's something a hard or a soft skill, or sometimes some people are looking for roles where they're kind of in between something, whether it's a very senior role that they're applying for and they're intermediate. Sometimes you have to make the decision, or you can make the decision, I should say, to move laterally. It's like, okay, or down even in the short term in what your expectations of your comp, your impact can be, so that you have a path to then grow forward. I remember speaking with someone, otherwise was really, really great, but they were just, they didn't quite have the experience we needed. And so my advice was, I think what this person needed was to go work for someone who could be a mentor for them, to be put into an environment where they had structure and they could learn from others who already knew what they were doing. And this advice came because this person, while having a senior title, had worked at a few very small startups where they were largely the only person in a design role. So they learn based on what those businesses need, but that's not the same thing as learning as what a good way to do something. I won't say the best, but a good way to practice. So my advice was, I hear you want this senior role. I actually think the best thing for you would be to take an intermediate role at a well-established company, finding out someone that can mentor you and learn. Spend a couple of years just desperately learning, and then you'll be really well positioned at that point.
That is such a nuanced point that you made there. But also, in addition to that, I would say maybe we can expand on this a little bit. I think, firstly, one thing I can sort of take away from that is this actually applies to if you had to not only hire somebody, but to give somebody a promotion or not when they come in to ask for a promotion, because you're like, there's blind spots. You don't recognize these are some of the skills that you're missing. It's not just, for example, it's not just about, packaging up the files really nicely, doing beautiful UI design, for example, but it's also about how it is that you work with others, how you receive feedback, how you communicate your ideas. It could be some of those things, right? In addition to, can you come in to work in person versus. Sure. So I think some of those things that you talked about apply really well when somebody comes for a promotion or when you're hiring someone. That's one. The second thing is that I think that we could sort of expand further on is, as we're personally and professionally maturing in our careers and life, is you also recognize that, in those early days, and I'm going to use this analogy of like brand and design as one thing for the sake of just a few minutes, is, when you only had a one product, you could get away with shitty design as long as it worked. And you could be like, for example, I remember the Green Pea parking app. There was only one of its kind, even though it was a shitty design, but it worked. And I was like, it's great. But what happens is that in the market, when other players come in, so brand and design not only help differentiate, but then now because people have choice, they're going to lean into something that's the easiest to use. For example, so do you have any thoughts on that? Or
I completely agree with it. In the absence of choice, the only option available, and again, so long as it's solving problems, will win. In the presence of choice and relatively equal product offerings and solutions, people are still emotional. And so they gravitate towards the things that make them feel good, feel easy, feel empowered, that they understand. And then, your better designed product, or the one that has a more compelling identity, which can be largely brand and aesthetic and tone and messaging, not necessarily functionality.
Like the most common, the most abused example, Windows and Mac. Till the time Mac didn't exist, the only choice that you had was Windows. But the moment that you found a product that was better designed, better experience, and charging a premium, also contrary, it actually didn't have some of the features that you would have in a Windows, people still picked a more expensive product because of the design and the brand. I think, and that's the most abused example, right? So
it's a hard example sometimes to make because these companies are decades old, and what happened 30 years ago is sometimes hard to remember, but generally they position themselves very differently. I think a lot of people resonated with that idea that we'll build something well and we want to be proud of what we're building and producing, providing to the world. And so there was a large emphasis put on the quality of the product, which would mean a premium price. You had to make trade-offs, right? And one of those is, if you want high quality, well, a trade-off generally is the cost of producing that thing. But the cost there generally can also be ubiquity, meaning it's also hard to totally saturate a market. And truthfully, early days, it's not like Apple suddenly had 80% market share. It took them a long time to build the business they have. And Microsoft built an equally valuable business, just in a different way with a different approach. Both worked. Both still work today. They're two extremely valuable companies, but their approach to how they build things, their identity and brand that surrounds them, they're different. They're not exactly the same.
What I also noticed is that with a competitor trying to differentiate themselves with design pushes the whole category up, because otherwise you're going to be left behind. So you have
to compete. Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, this is now the perfect segue into what role you've been playing for the last 10 years. Is that, so I think it would be helpful to give the audience some context in terms of what's the product that Street Context builds and delivers, and then how you kind of use design or brand, or what are the experiences that you've used to differentiate or get people to adopt. And so I would love to sort of now get into that topic.
I joined 10 and a half years ago now. Second employee, first design employee. So we had the founder, CTO, then myself. And then the thing was at the time, the product was and still is largely a sales enablement tool for institutional capital markets. So we're talking about big banks, hedge funds on the other side of it. The idea being that banks distribute a lot of their content, their research, their ideas through email. And this information is generally used by asset managers and hedge funds to inform their research inform their investment decisions. So if you think about something local to Toronto, like the Teachers Pension Plan is going to invest or divest from certain positions on the back of having an opinion on what's going to happen. That opinion gets partially informed by expertise developed at certain banks, like say a JP Morgan, a Morgan Stanley, this sort of a thing. All of this largely is communicated over email. And so when the business was started, 2012, 2013, there wasn't really anything in the space to help with that. And the founder, Blair, was actually working on a desk in RBC in New York. These emails are being sent out and no one really knows what happens next. And so if your job as a salesperson is to follow up or find a client who's interested in the topic you're covering, there's no insight into how to do that. And so his idea was, well, let's build something that does that. And so our initial product that got us to product market fit was really an email tracking tool that allowed for you to, manage lists of contacts you wanted to communicate with, email those out, and then what you got on the back of it was some sort of indicator, whether that email was delivered and opened, if there were links inside of it where they clicked, was anyone doing anything with information you sent. Very like in a very consumer way. We've had some parallels to something like a MailChimp or Campaign Monitor in the sense that it does something similar. The angle that's different for us was, and we continue to develop, was we didn't want to build horizontally. We wanted to stay very, very focused on that industry. And so much of the functionality we developed was to make sure we stayed relevant to institutional markets, meaning we didn't build anything that was interesting but didn't help them specifically. So there are some things we did which are hard to replicate if you're a horizontal player moving into the market. But from a design perspective, one of the things that we really leaned into from the beginning was user experience. It was very important to me and the business that we differentiate on how we were building an enterprise product effectively. We wanted it to be as easy to use as a consumer product at the time. So it had to care about aesthetics, sure, but it really had to care about how things were built, the trade-offs you were making. We really defended how many things got put on the screen, how many filters, how many controls, how many buttons, even though enterprise products tend to grow to have quite a significant feature set, we really wanted to help constrain that as much as possible so that for the user, it was really, really easy to figure out how to use the product and then repeatedly use it. And luckily, there really hasn't been there haven't been that many players move into this space in the last 10 years who have been a compelling enough alternative for us to be replaced.
But then also on that spectrum of like, what is the absolute must feature that we must have versus let's scrap it. So how did those conversations go, and then how did those decisions get made? And
messy is,
let's get into the messiness.
Yeah. Well, I mean, early days, you build the vision of the founder, right? You have to. They understand the business. They worked in it. They've seen that opportunity. So really early days, your outcomes you're driving towards, and largely even the implementation of that can be hyper specific because they kind of see the way. And that worked really well for us for quite a while. Then as we expanded our customer base and some of the product offerings, for many years, actually, we took quite an experimental approach where the focus would shift kind of, because what happened for us was our type of customer shifted. So within that market, you have titans who make billions of dollars a year, and then you have smaller guys who make hundreds of thousands a year, and who we at the beginning, you'll take almost anybody because you need revenue, you need clients, you need to validate things. Eventually, we strategically changed how we were approaching clients to sort of target a very specific group. That then drove a lot of our product development and investment decisions, because we were just simply missing things that were necessary to go after a large enterprise client. We needed more APIs, we needed to support integrations, we needed to have much more focus on info security and disaster recovery processes. So in an interesting way, we did some product experimentation and some investment based on customer feedback, and where we were seeing gaps in our ability to deliver a key point of value. But largely it was looking at the market and trying to make a strategic decision about where we wanted to sell and which part of the market we were interested in capturing. That drove a very significant amount of the decision about what we built or didn't build. In fact, to the point where we didn't build much new customer sort of in the product facing investments for a while, because we were so focused on below the waterline, back end work. And it was absolutely the right decision, to be clear, but it did mean that your teams suddenly were working, not necessarily in UI that you felt the customer would really love, and you're getting a lot of positive feedback on, but you couldn't do it yet. You had other things to worry about. So that's why I say it's messy, because it changes. I mean, obviously you're driven by the leadership and how they view your opportunities, and largely they've done a good job of having us focus on the right things. Sometimes we made mistakes, and we focused on a part of the market or an opportunity that turned out not to be available to us. So, but that happens. I mean, it's part of the way of moving forward and through that experience. Where we are today is actually a bit different. We completed a lot of that work. We're now looking forward to what would we want to be true in 2025 and beyond, to set the business up for that next sort of inflection point of growth. And that is separate type of investment, right? So now we're looking at scalability of our data sets, our database, query models, these sorts of things, in addition to what new products or features or functionality do we believe should be in place to allow for that growth. So it's not a straightforward answer. It really depends on what the business is focused on in any given time.
This actually opens up a whole bunch of interesting topics and themes. And I'm going to pose a question to you and let you think about it while I sort of share one perspective of my own.
Sure.
One thing is, based on sort of these different experiences, and because you were there at a very early stage from day one, pretty much, let's say, from the grand scheme of things, is for somebody who, let's say, I'm not sure how much of finance background did you have, or how much did you understand the space, that you could go in and actually fight certain decisions on this feature not existing. So I would love for you to think about, as a person coming in to a new category, a new space, how did you sort of firstly upskill yourself, learn the lingo, speak that language, and then be able to contribute in a meaningful way? How did that journey for you look like? You can take a second to think about that while I share. Personally, growing up, I got into design in a sort of similar fashion, computers, and then art was my main thing. Sucked at school, got into art school, failed at that too, but eventually started my own agency, and I was just kind of an entrepreneur. But then when I moved to Canada, I started working with Deloitte as a client. And I recognized that when I started working with them is, for the first 6 months, I had no idea what these guys were talking about. I was like, they were using all these acronyms, all this industry jargon. So for me to even begin to contribute to the conversation in a meaningful way, for this first 6 months, I had to just shut up and just listen and really understand, okay, what are they actually even talking about? And then I recognized that, it took about a year for me to then begin to turn that around into like, okay, now I can be like, hey guys, wait a second. How is this related to that? And so a big part of that was the learning that takes time. Two is to be able to contribute in a meaningful way instead of offering solutions, asking more questions. So
especially if you're going into an industry where you don't have background. I didn't have any background in the financial space. It was very new to me. I think it's really about taking that to heart and leaning into the fact that you don't know anything. It's really important to try to ask as many questions as possible. But I think the thing we did early that was really beneficial to me was that obviously the founder had come from the space, so he was able to patiently spend time with us to help us understand enough of what was happening that we could empathize with the problem set and begin to understand it. But the thing that we did that was for me personally was really, really valuable was early days we brought on advisors who were from the industry. And they could physically come to our office and spend time with me and other members of the team and ask questions about, how does this really work? What are the different roles? Not even looking for problems, just an understanding of how the industry works and why its constituent parts are in place. Then and they were invaluable for a number of years as we were just trying to get our first customers. Then once that we saw a little bit of momentum, and we could build trust with our customers, speaking with them regularly became the single most valuable piece, right? And I know people talk a lot about you should talk to your customers and you should do interviews and stuff, but and that's absolutely true in particular for helping to identify opportunities and what have you, but just generally understanding what their life is like and why they're motivated or why they have certain motivations and why other things don't matter to them. Particularly important if your industry and the market you're trying to serve has many different types of user or persona. In ours, there are a handful, it's like 3 to 5 macro personas, but within that, it changes a lot. There's a lot of micro, and that changes based on the scale of the business and how they define a particular, like a salesperson is not a salesperson, depending on where you are. And so building strong personal relationships with those clients really elevated my ability to understand where they were coming from, to the point where, when I moved from design into product management, I would then do trips down to New York to go meet them in person, walk on the floor, be in the environment, physically standing there, watching them do their jobs and watching them use our product while doing their job. And then you have this really, just like right now, you have this very dynamic space to sort of ask questions of why did you do that? Or more often than not, what I found was they were looking to me and our team to be able to answer questions of how they could better use the product, how they could use it to be more efficient in their jobs, really asking for support. And in that, then you're able to say, well, why and how? And so those things over time were instrumental in building that knowledge of, certainly not, I wouldn't say an expertise because I don't do the job, but a knowledge that really gives you a leg to stand on when you now need to internally within the organization represent those people and what they care about and what they're doing and how that interacts or impacts what you as a business care about. But that common piece is just always trying to be in touch with someone who does the job, knows it deeply, sort of bring up to speed. Really, though, that combined with having an advisor who you can sort of go to and say, hey, here's what I heard. Here's how I interpret what I heard. Do you think this is right? And then having that person who's not doing the job, you're not interrupting them. They are there to help you. Giving you that feedback for like, no, you got this wrong, or yes, you have it right, or it needs to be tweaked. It's all of those pieces over time that were really helpful.
How did the founder even pick you? Because he could have easily said, no, I want somebody who has experience working on fintech. And at the time, what were you like as a designer back then versus, because obviously within these last 10 years, you also did mention that you switched from design to product. So I would love for you to sort of share that journey that you've had.
I think my opinion of myself when this all started was higher than it probably should have been. At least as a practitioner that comparing myself to say today, if I were to hire someone in to do something similar. But effectively, there was a job posting on a job board, and I had finished school, had actually worked at a startup or two beforehand, had known that I wanted to continue doing that type of work, startup early stage companies, but was looking for the next thing. And there was very little information about the company. It was, again, very new. So I applied and, used some of the assets that I had created in the past, whether freelancing or actually some things from school, just as a very poor version of a portfolio. And it was enough to have a conversation. And I think in the conversation, both with himself and the CTO at the time, really just trying to understand what the opportunity was, and if I could help. The interview was about an hour of him pitching what he thought the market could look like in the future, our ability to impact that, and then talking about, what we needed to do in the next 6 months to a year. And it was exciting enough for me to be interested in, even though I really didn't understand the market at all. I resonated with his pitch and him and what he was trying to do. And for me, that was enough. And clearly at the time, it was enough then too. He needed somebody, I needed somebody, and it was just good timing.
That is such a good point. Yeah, I remember that personally. Also, there's this when I started working with Deloitte, we needed to bring in a full-time designer, and there was this girl that I was talking to who had done some freelance work with us, and I wanted her to be full-time with us. And initially, when I asked her, she's like, "No, I don't want to be doing PowerPoint and all that stuff." But then I kept engaging with her, and I said, "Why don't you come down and meet us?" And so one of my colleagues, Maddie, and we went downstairs to the Deloitte cafeteria and met this girl. And right after that meeting, she's like, "Yeah, I want to work with you guys." It's just, I'm not trying to blow smoke up my own ass, but I think these moments, you're actually making a decision based on, this is the person I want to be working with.
Sure. Yeah.
Because PowerPoint is the last thing that you wanted to do, for example. But it's that, this sounds cool. This could be fun.
I agree with that. And I think that if you're a creative individual, and I think that there are many people who don't necessarily get credit for being creative, and I would put most people into this group. But if you're trying to build anything, then you're a creative individual. And I think that I at least gravitate to opportunities and challenges, and then the people, right? So I didn't know anything about capital markets. It was not even remotely interested to me. If you told me that's what the job was, am I excited about that? Probably not. But in meeting the people and understanding that it's a really big challenge, that is enough for me. It's check one is that this is something that's going to be hard to do. So that's interesting. Step two is there's a chance you can do it. Okay, so it's not a fool's errand. We could maybe have a real shot at this. And then it's the people. Do I want to spend time with these people? And especially for early days, I think for the first 2 years, I didn't take any vacation, right? And you're working 10 to 12 hour days. So you have to like the people. You have to at least get along with them. So I think to your example, it's so much of it is you're having a preconceived idea of what the job may be. But then when you meet the people, you say, okay, yes, I like Paul. I could work with Paul. You go for it. And I think hiring is so much of getting the baseline stuff out of the way. Do you have the skill set to do the job? Could I see you achieving the outcomes I need you to achieve? Okay, great. Now for past that, it's can we work together? Right? Can you fit into the team as constructed or as we want to construct it? And if there's a really good rapport there, then it's probably going to work out. Again, assuming all the hard and soft skills are already in place.
With every job, even though you might be super passionate about a subject, there's going to be a lot of things that are going to be you're only going to survive and do them is because of the overarching passion or the people.
I think over the last 10 years, the business has changed so much that it is without a doubt not what it was 2 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. And so you have to be willing to go through that many uncomfortable moments, many moments of growth where you challenge what you currently know and what you're currently able to do with what the business and people around you need to happen next. So you're always on this like growth, this path of growth. And that never stops, right? At any point, ideally. And so when you get to the point where you end up leaving or something changes where you can't stay at that company, you're just starting again, but hopefully now you're taking all of your lessons and experiences with you into the next thing. And it's, again, you're a more prepared individual, but you're still looking for that match. Like, is this a good problem? And then if it is.
So actually, there's another interesting point there is like maybe just one or two examples is how were the design decisions being made at the onset when you had just started in the first 2-3 years, when you're just kind of trying to do product market fit, find place in the world, versus you evolving over time and now you play a slightly different role. So how are those decisions made today?
That transition was really challenging for me because at the beginning, I was the designer. I had a lot of outsized impact, but we had a small team. I think early, like in that 2013 area, maybe about 5 or 6 people. But we were all really close. And so what I could do is, we would know what we were trying to achieve. So I could do some really rough wireframes or whiteboard sketches or whatever, but I could bring the whole team in. And we could debate why we were building it that way, whether we thought it would be good or not, tweak it. But then when it came time to translate that into, say, a higher fidelity mockup that was actually going to be built, largely that was on my shoulders. I'd have to put that together and have an opinion on whether or not there were no design systems, right? So whether or not that aligned with where we wanted to take the product. And at the time, we also had no early days. We had no branding. Like, we changed the company's name. We didn't really have colors in place, anything. So you're just working in that case with myself, the CEO and some of the founding team members, just to put stuff together that feels good, knowing that eventually it'll evolve, it'll change, but you just need to start somewhere so you can move really fast. I don't think we got too tripped up over the aesthetics so much as it was like, if things are obviously not working, change them. But otherwise, we have bigger fish to fry than whether or not you choose this shade of orange or that shade, right? So there wasn't a lot there, but over the years, you now establish a brand, you establish an aesthetic and a visual language that you're using, and we brought on another designer, and now the two of us had to work together to make sure we stayed in alignment or challenged each other on directions or changes, and now we needed a more formal way of sort of saying, hey, rest of the dev team or the leadership team, here's a suggestion on how we change things. And we made mistakes. I made mistakes. There's more than one occasion early days where I changed something and the CEO didn't know until he was demoing. And so that was a lesson learned. We're like, okay, you moving fast sometimes causes problems if you're not connecting and communicating the right way. I wouldn't do that again, but that sort of thing, early days, very much changed to now, where now I'm no longer in the product design role. I'm in a product role, but we have a product designer who's fantastic. We've had people who throughout the years who worked or didn't work in a design role, but a lot of it is, of aesthetic change is opinions, but it's aligning on opinions, right? On having a shared view of what will work and won't work. And then defining for the product together with the designer, how do we want to build this? So for us, we were a web only, a SaaS product meant there was no mobile application. We were likely not to have one anytime soon, but we did have to have opinions on how flexible was this design going to be. Did we care about meeting accessibility standards early days? No. Now, yes. How consistent does our design system? Do we have a design system? And we had all these things that you operationalize the process of design, and now you need an owner of that. I was no longer that owner. Someone else is. And so how all of that gets decided now is on that person's shoulders, and they have to kind of make the pitch. And now I'm a stakeholder, but I'm not an owner. And, the best you can kind of do is try to influence or inform based on some rational opinions. But at the end of the day, it's that person's responsibility to make those choices, or people, if there's.
One of the things that you're also saying is, different things matter at different stages of the company. And so a lot of times when we read something online or hear a podcast like this, we're like, oh, well, they're doing OKRs, so we need to do OKRs, or we need to have some rigid design system. It's like, no, you haven't even, you're just a sapling at this point. You're not like a fully baked tree. So of course, I think that's one thing to keep in mind, is that whenever we read advice or hear advice or whatever, or see a process or something, it makes sense at a specific stage and it doesn't apply to every step of the way. So that's one thing I definitely took away from sort of what you were describing. The other thing is you described sort of the role that, aligning on visual design and how that design role has been playing. And you guys recently went through a rebrand.
Yeah, we did.
How did that conversation happen, and how did you lead it, or who led it, or what are the motions that go on internally?
Yeah, what ended up happening is that the way that we were pitching the product, or the company, I should say, had been similar for quite a few years, and it was working. However, as we changed who we were marketing to, the type of client we were going after, what we were and we were sort of adjusting our go-to-market strategy and how we were talking about the product, we realized at the same time that the way that our customers were using our product and the way that they thought about it was not exactly aligned with how we were thinking about it. Short story eventually being that the CEO identified that it's probably would be a good idea at that point in the business to reconsider how we talk about the business. I think at the time, early days, we had been very much focused on insights and delivering email, and which practice works. But if you're trying to enter an entirely new market and speak to an executive sponsor at a certain level, what they want is to understand the value or the impact you may be making to the business. And we weren't really talking about that. Like our marketing website, I should say, didn't really do a very great job of that. So we really thought we should change how we're positioning the business and the product. That might be a good opportunity for us to reconsider whether the branding is still in place. Interestingly, when we named the company, Street Context didn't have an E at the end, so it was TXT. And of course, most people put the E in there when they're just writing the company's name. Oddly, it was just one of those things where it's like, well, maybe we should fix that at the same time. So just a culmination of a few things happened. We then chose a branding agency to work with, a Focus Lab, who's absolutely fantastic to work with. They did a really great job. And then we embarked on a multi-month project to reconsider how we would position and brand the company itself. Once that was done, we then rebuilt the marketing website around this positioning of trying to build out the market space or the category around email intelligence, and how we were taking, we were layering in a level of customer relationship and intelligence and insight into just emails and how people would interact with those. I think it was a good decision to do at the time. We made further decisions like a rebrand of the actual product itself, which probably wasn't wholly necessary, but that exercise involved, myself, the CEO, we had a product marketer at the time, some other executives in go-to-market and product, and really trying to ensure that we rebranded the company to be true to what we were becoming, but still held true to the fundamentals that Blair, the CEO, really believed in, where we had come from, what we were trying to do. I thought it was a great experience. And now I think it is a bit easier for our customers to just end up on the website, read through what values we're trying to deliver for whom, and understand, what the business can do for them.
Just want to clarify. One thing that you mentioned was that you guys sort of shifted from speaking, instead of features, speaking more to the value and the outcomes / benefits. So obviously you're now speaking more in a language that's closer to the customer. So that's like one strategic change that you're doing as a brand, and also how the product speaks from a marketing sense. But then you also mentioned that there were some product tweaks that you made. Now, I'm so curious that when you went through this whole redesign, rebrand, it's almost like, you're revisiting not necessarily the business model, but you're looking at how the business outwardly and inwardly communicates through visual design or whatever manifestation that is. Do you recall any specific workshops or conversations or exercises? Well, number one, that's the first part. The second part is any specific strategic decisions that you specifically remember that you made that you were like, that totally makes sense?
During the rebrand, we had regular workshops. So the agency that we worked with, we met every week or two. We had a lot of homework as well. So where we had to go away and think about how we think about the business, how our customers think about the business. And I think that was a key thing that was a habit through this process that we had to work on and keep reminding ourselves of. It's not just about how we think about street context and the value that can be provided. It's how do our customers think about it? What value would they say we bring to the table or not? Because, it's very easy for us to say we do X, Y, Z, which is so great and amazing, etc. And we say it in our language, our words. But when you talk to your customers about it, they may not say the same things at all. But if they do, they may not say it in the same way. And I think that was a learning through that process for everyone, just in the way that we communicated with our agency, about what we were trying to achieve and how we would talk about these values and whatnot. That definitely shifted, and I think for the better. The outcomes after that, and as we reinforced that, were much better.
That's just music to my ears. That's literally all. That's all I do with the work that I've been doing for the last 6 years. Is really just think about, okay, this is how you talk. This is your lingo and language, and it could be even proprietary to your company. But how do your customers interact with it? What is the value that they're getting? What are the words that they're using? You could be saying, this KPI, this thing, blah, blah, blah. But the customers just like, no more painful soft, they're probably using like a very normal language. So this whole exercise is so just thinking about very cathartic to me as well. Okay. So as you're doing that and you're going through that process, was there any specific eureka moment and I'm actually speaking to the alignment part, like how did, because as part of a rebrand or redesign and communication and all that stuff, a huge part of that is not only just what it looks like at the end, but it's like alignment. And that alignment happens when everybody has a shared like eureka.
There were a number of them, and I don't know that there was a big one, but a number of small moments. And, I think we spent so much time at the beginning speaking about values and identity and like the outcomes we're trying to drive and why we exist and who we are and all this kind of stuff. But there's a lot of sharing to the agency that occurred at that point. And so none of that was new and exciting because we had been thinking about that and feeling it for a long time. But what was really interesting was when they came back and had taken the time to synthesize that, reposition it in the way that they were talking about it, and then start delivering, assets to us that help to reinforce. So we could sort of say, well, in creating our visual identity and the way that we would talk about ourselves, it's like, what things begin to emotionally resonate as a group and what don't as it aligns to what we had shared with them. And we had some interesting debates. That was a really interesting point. Kind of a small moment there is you think you're aligned until someone puts, like 6 colors and pictures on a mood board and then everyone chooses a different thing, and it's like, oh, okay, maybe we don't all agree on the visual direction and whether that is or isn't us or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've lived this before.
Oh yeah, almost every other day. But yeah.
Yeah. So that was really impactful because what it also did is it shifted where the locus of the decision making occurred. So at the beginning, like everyone said, well, this is still the CEO's vision. It needs to work for him or her, at the end of the day. But then you get into the project and everyone's contributing and everyone has ideas. And then you get to this decision point of like, well, what are we going to choose? Because you do have to make a choice and you can change it later, but you do have to make a choice. And how we went through the debate and like everyone's perspective, and then you could see people start to grab it. Okay, yeah, I agree with this bit a bit more. Or like you can kind of see the teams start to gravitate towards one or two directions. And what was an interesting learning for me, especially as someone creative coming into that, is that though I had strong opinions, this is still the founder's company, and if they don't buy into it, if they sacrifice their vision for the harmonizing with the team, it doesn't work, because at the end of the day, they're going to just want to change it later. So removing ego, taking a step back and going, here's how, still sharing my truth, my perspective, but then saying, but what really works for them? That was a really important moment. And I think that we all kind of got to have our say, have our piece from all those different perspectives, but still acknowledging that, okay, at the end of the day, this still needs to work for him. It's still, it's his company. He started, he has a strong vision on where he wants to take it. And that ended up being a really powerful moment or series of small moments, because it allowed us to orient our perspectives in the right way, so we weren't at cross purposes anymore, which is sort of at the beginning. It's messy and everyone, you don't really know if you haven't done the experience or that workflow before as to how it'll all shape out.
Some of the things were like housekeeping, like, the name, people are spelling it this way, let's fix that, and then having somebody else come in and read your label, because sometimes when you're within your own universe, you're a champion of your product, of your team, of what you do. It's hard to see outside of that, so hence the analogy, reading your own label. And then really shifting from this is what we make, what we do, to the value and outcomes of why you use us.
Yeah.
Right. And orientation of that communication, whether that's in marketing, presentations, blah, blah, blah. And then alignment, how to align on some of these things and where the alignments don't happen. So I think there's some great examples that you shared. Now, in the course of all of this, as things are happening, somewhere you decide to switch from a design role to a product role. First of all, for a noob, stupid person like me, what does that even mean? And what made you jump ship and leave us all behind?
Well, that's funny because, we could talk about that next, but I don't believe, I didn't know this about myself until the opportunity was kind of presented to me. So I had been obviously an individual contributor designer. I led a small team at one point, but the needs of the business, while we were so heavily focused on things like enterprise value, but much of the work that we were doing was API development and integrations and working with Salesforce partnerships and this kind of a thing. We weren't doing much on the UI. And so I was feeling as though I wasn't really contributing strictly from a design perspective as much as I could. And my boss, who was the head of product, had been quietly, slowly trying to hint that maybe I consider product. And at some point I had this conversation. I was like, I really don't think this is like, I'm contributing as much as I would like to. And then he was very explicit. He said, you should really consider moving into product. And I kind of pushed back against it for a bit. eventually we agreed that I would kind of do a trial run of it for a couple of months. And if that worked out, then we would keep going. If not, then I could go back to doing product design and all as well. Turns out I really like it. Turns out I was pretty good at it. And what I came to appreciate is that I think that everyone says that the skill sets are shared anyways, largely between a designer and a product manager. I think that is also true between many of the different people that make up a product development team. I think that your best product people understand how to build the product, either technically or through design. I think your best designers understand the same things, how it's technically built, as well as why you would choose the things to build, where you would focus. And I think your best engineers understand their craft deeply, but also how to build things to make sure that they are, provide a great user experience and that they align with business value. Finding people who are interested in all of those things in those different areas is not exactly easy. But I, anyways, fell into that space based on my past experiences of understanding how things are built, clearly being able to design for them. But then I also always found myself kind of arguing with product managers.
That never happens.
Yeah. And yeah, a lot.
That never happens. Oh my God. Product guys never argue with designers.
No. So we had a lot of debates about what we were building and why we were building and this kind of thing. And so eventually it was kind of like, okay, well.
I just, by the way, like how you so mildly put these things across. Like, it was like a nothing.
No big deal. I just been having those arguments for about 6 years. To the point where.
6 years. Okay.
Well, where it's a little bit more than just. The arguments we were having were a little bit different from, I think we should build it this way or not build it this way, to like, why are we building it at all? This doesn't seem like it's what we're trying to achieve. Or it's kind of where I think what really the message was like, okay, well, if you think you know better, come do better. Come join the product team and help make those choices. And I've really enjoyed it because I get to still work with designers, which is extremely rewarding for me. I'm very close to the developers and understanding, and I see the creative path for them and how they think about tackling these challenges. But then I also get to spend a lot more time with our customers and closer to the business to tie together, strategically, why would we spend time in this area? Do we think it's going to help us or our customers? Hopefully both. And I found a lot of personal value in being able to have that type of a conversation and then still have the creative outlet of trying to figure out how are we as a team going to tackle this. I think if there's one thing that I came to appreciate, it was that I really hated being in the design seat, being told what to build. Because I felt that it really disempowered me and the team. What I really valued was in being able to be presented with the facts, presented with all of the supporting information, and guided through the work of trying to find a solution. And so now as a PM, that's where I like spending my time, is to help make the team experts in the space and in the opportunities and to get them excited about what that could mean for the business and the impact they can have. And then hopefully in doing all of that, allow for them to come to the table with, here are the options and here's how we think we could tackle this. And here's a better way that you hadn't thought of to approach this problem. Right. And then to me, that's extremely rewarding, because then truly the team is the one shipping the work and owning the outcomes and the deliveries, and avoid finger pointing of like, well, we did what the PM said to do. It's like, okay. But that goes all the way back to what we talked about at the beginning of being empowered and owning your own future and your your own work. If you are willing, if it's okay and you don't mind handing over that responsibility to someone else, there's lots of places that do that and it works for them. Not how I like to work. I'd rather everyone be an owner, everyone have strong input, and for us to have debates. But the next sort of adventure for me is an interesting hybrid role where I will still be PM by title and responsibility, but also responsible for large aspects of the design as well. So a mix of both things.
Connecting the dots here, name of the podcast, dots. I don't know, maybe you thought about this. Maybe this is just, I'm having an epiphany right now, is at the beginning of the conversation, you talked about, you were sort of in that basement and you had to have your team come and pull you out of that basement.
Yeah.
And just now where you are professional, you're like, you actually really enjoy talking to clients and being in that product role. Seeing that evolution of that kid who was in his basement to now you're actually leaning into that and saying, hey.
And it was terrifying, I will admit, when we started doing that. When I was in the design role to begin with, but going outside of the four walls of the office or your room or whatever you're in, putting yourself in a position where someone is going to ask you, how do I do this? Or what do you think about that? And being okay with saying, I don't know, but I'll go find out. Right. And that was very scary for a while. And you get comfortable with it with enough exposure. But I think that transition was very hard in a professional sense. Now the benefits of that are immense. And now having done that, I think in getting comfortable with it, it creates a comfort with learning, a comfort with not needing to be right or wrong, but in just understanding, which is in itself its own kind of enjoyable experience. But yeah, from getting to a point where I enjoy that from where I was before is taken decades.
You could have never guessed, and you've overly underestimated where you would land, right?
Sure.
For somebody who's a designer and listening to this, who might be right now thinking about getting into a product role or has not even considered it, what are maybe like two things that are completely different from what you used to do? One, two, and what are maybe two things that are the same?
The same is putting the customer first and thinking about the user, right? So I still think through the opportunities and how I'm going to do the research from the perspective of how does this help our customers do what they need to do? Just like I was doing as a product role or product design role, trying to figure out how are we going to provide a path or a workflow or a solution, that same line of thinking. The major difference is just that your output is largely written, right? It is not designs. I mean, sometimes I draw squares on a screen, but realistically, most of my time now is in gathering information, summarizing that information, and then presenting it in a written format such that it gives everyone around me the same understanding. So your output is largely writing. It is you spend a lot more time in meetings, on phone calls. So the things that you're producing are very different. But I think you're trying to build the same type of understanding. So I think it is a natural step sideways, if it's out of a strictly design lens into one that's more product focused. I think you have a lot of the same needs of skills, soft and hard skills, that is, to do the job. But it's definitely not the same job. I don't think it's a necessary path. So the one thing I would say is, if you're, at a certain point in your design career and you're thinking what's next, product doesn't have to be it. Like, you don't need to move sideways. There's always that path to continue becoming either a people manager or a senior IC, obviously in design. But for me, it just happened to be that the set of things that I ended up really enjoying about the product design space ended up being the things that are necessary to be successful in a product role.
What would be a reason for somebody who's a design leader to not get into a product role? Like, what are the things that would be annoying to them, maybe?
You end up speaking into more of the business. So some of my strongest relationships, which I had anyways, but really I leveraged them heavily in a product role, are with our support team, our success team, our sales team. And you end up spending a lot of time negotiating and talking about roadmaps and impact and whatever. And you have a lot of inbound requests where I do think that is not really enjoyable all the time, or not, at least not for everyone. Whereas if you could stay in the design path, if you're in an IC, you still get to produce the designs. You get to go deep on that creative element and really sink your teeth into that. If you stay in design, but you go to the leadership path, you do move into obviously people management and the strategic leadership and these types of things. So they're similar, certainly. But I do think, if you really love to create the designs, to prototype, to build out the solution, you enjoy the creation of that aesthetic component as well. You lose all of that. So I get to live vicariously through the product designers that I work with. You end up being that person who's like, give me the mouse, right? Just not because you can do it better, but because you just want to do it. And that can be definitely a tough transition.
Now that you have, I'm guessing, fully migrated into a product role, moving forward, would you want more product roles, are you thinking? Even if you moved out of, let's say, a street context or whatever you wanted to do next? Or would you be like, no, I did this for a while here, but now when I go to the next, like, how are you thinking about it?
I've really enjoyed it. And I really enjoy learning more about it. And in speaking with people who have been doing this for 10 or 20 years, like really experienced, I get excited about the type of impact that they've made in their careers and how they help to shape the teams to be successful. I really enjoy that. And in particular, I've always found myself liking to be in a position where I'm not necessarily the hero delivering a thing, but I'm the supporting cast, right? And I can help others be 10x or 10% better, I should say, or 15% better, and can do the things that are not necessarily so flashy, but need to be done. And I don't know if that's product or not product, but I do know that in that space, it allows for me to lift up my peers on my team and the people around me, for them to be more successful, for them to have that voice to contribute to their work. I really enjoy that. I have found that lever in the product space is bigger for me than it was in the design space. And so I think I would stay there, if for no other reason than that.
It's similar to me. Like, I find it so much satisfaction in like helping somebody else like get there. And you're like, oh, that is, I think, more satisfying than anything I've produced myself. What I want to do is one quick activity that I do with all my guests is that you're going to pick a number between 3001 and 1.
No pressure. All right. I'll go with the first thing that came to my head. 2,997.
2,997.
Okay,
hold on. 2,997. Okay, let's see here. Okay, last page. Okay.
Oh, all right.
Have I ever called someone, and this is you.
Okay.
Have I ever called someone a liar to their face? Do I regret doing it? Difficult conversation. Here, if you want to read it for yourself also once, it's just right there.
Yeah.
It just helps.
I certainly have in jest, where it's like pseudo serious. I don't know if I've done it with like a full sense of anger and wrath, that sort of thing. Generally, I'm going to say probably no. Not with that aggressive intention. I think in a pseudo serious, pseudo joking way, yes. Do I regret that? No. I think if you're not personally harmed by something in which you feel the need to accuse someone of lying to you, then I think it's more about shared understanding, right? And in those cases, I could think of things where I'm like, well, who lies to you regularly? I think all of my customers have always lied to me 100% of the time, and I think that's generally true about most people. If you haven't read the mom test, one of the points they make is that your customers will always lie to you all the time because they want to make you happy. And I think it's stuff like that where I've called people liars, where I'm like, okay, are you telling me what I want to hear? Right? Or are you telling me what I need to hear? And in that case, no, I don't regret it, because I'd rather know the unvarnished truth, at least their perspective of that truth, and then talk about it, work through it together.
That applies even more as a product person who is, because it's like, what's that thing? I think what you're hinting at is like how people think, feel, what they say, what they do. All of those could be different.
Like how often, the inverse of that question is, how often have you told the unvarnished truth without fear of rejection, reciprocation, any sort of negative sentiment? Just own what you were feeling in the moment. That doesn't happen a lot, particularly if what you're feeling is critical of the people or situation around you.
Oh shit, that just reminded me of something. Actually, in fact, when I just started working with Deloitte, and I was, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, that, for the first 6 months, I had no idea what people were talking about.
Yeah.
And so my role was just to be a fly on the wall. And I remember, this is early on. This is like the first, second, third month or whatever. And I'm sitting in one of these big boardrooms on the 19th floor overlooking the Toronto skyline. And there's a whole bunch of leaders in the room. And I'm just sitting there quietly listening to what they're talking about. And one of the lead client partners gets up and he says like something. And for like 2-3 minutes, he just goes on and on. And then one of the sales coaches who I look up to as also not my client, but also my mentor, he just gets up and he's like, I'll just use a random name. He's like, Dave, I have no idea what you were talking about for the last 2 minutes. Can you talk to me like I'm 5 years old? And in that moment, I realized that the culture that they have there is in that room, like you said, it comes top down. It's like, it's okay to say, I don't know what's going on, because everybody in the room is just sitting quietly and you think like everybody knows what's going on. And then slowly, but surely everybody starts saying, hey, I have no idea what you were talking about either. Anyway, so that's kind of based on what you were saying, that I was reminded of that one. It just imprinted in my mind forever.
Something I learned a long time ago, I was a kid, but was it is helpful for you to pretend to be, the dumb person in the room sometimes. And even if you know the answer to a question, you understand what is happening, it is to everyone's benefit for you to ask the question, what do you mean? Like, or why this, or why that, even if you know the answer, because invariably someone likely doesn't know the answer. Right. And it's like, you get to look like the dummy who doesn't know. Who cares? Right.
Beautifully said. I think that is bang on, spot on. I think that comes with maturity. It comes with being humble, curious. And by the way, and it being that person, it's like, oh wait, we need to explain it to this person, and that gives everybody an excuse to come on the same page. It's like one of the most powerful tools in like alignment of stakeholders and idea. Like, bang on. I think if anybody else listening to this, if they could take away one thing, is just be that person who's like, wait, what are you guys talking about? Even if you have the answer. That's such brilliant advice. Okay. So having said that, to wrap up, based on the conversation that we've had around design career, also switching to product, are there any final notes and thoughts that you would like to leave the audience with?
If there's nothing else, really, it's just that, you are able to do anything you want to be able to do, right? It's just a matter of envisioning that for yourself and working through it. So whether it's a career in product design or product management or a nurse or something else entirely, it's really just about saying this is what you want to do, whether it's hard or not, be damned, and then find a way to do it. And understand that your life and career and path forward is only yours. No one else can do it for you. No one else will want to do it for you. But if you help yourself, you will be surprised how many other people suddenly step up to also help you. ownership and initiative is incredibly important. Don't let the important things in your life slip you by because you're afraid to take that step. Or
I mean, you're like the perfect embodiment of that. So thank you. This was a great conversation. First conversation. We'll definitely have you back. I definitely want to have you back. Actually, we want to talk about some other esoteric things as well. But this was a great conversation. I took away a lot of learnings, and I'm definitely going to be thinking about my personal days living in that basement. And here I am interviewing people.
Yeah, this is exciting. This is great. I appreciate for having me on, and nice to catch up again.
Thanks, man. This was fun. Thank you.
Yeah. That's great.
Oh, dude. Fucking awesome. Killed it.